All right. Well, up next, we have Justin O'Day, who is a coworker of mine at WSU Extension. Justin, are you on? There you are.
I am on.
Awesome.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep, I can hear you great. You sound great.
All right. So thanks, Patrick.
Mm-hmm.
And today I'm going to talk to everybody about forest cultivated mushroom production systems. The picture on the front here on the cover page is of a trial that we're doing that Patrick's involved in along with Stephen Bramwell in Thurston County. And I'm going to talk about that trial in a little bit, but at first I'm going to go through some of the basics of forest cultivated production systems for mushrooms. Just a second.
Justin, I'll let you, it's up to you if you want to pause for questions throughout or kind of wait till the end. Just whatever you decide, it's totally fine.
Okay. All right, so today we're going to exclusively talk about forest cultivated mushroom systems. We're not going to talk about indoor bag systems. Some people get them mixed up or sort of conflate the two, but we're really talking about systems that are grown on logs. So these are traditional systems that originally originated in China and made their way to Japan, where they really got well established. And then in about the 1980s, the systems, there was interest in these systems in the US, and it came over about then and started to get popularized about then. Amongst the universities that have actually been working on these systems in the US, Cornell University is probably the most prominent, some at the University of Missouri, some at the University of Vermont, trying to think of some other ones too, but most of it, the bulk of it has been at Cornell, and mostly on refining systems for the Eastern US. When we talk about these systems, we're talking mainly about producing only a few select types of mushrooms. So the main one is shiitake. It's the most common mushroom produced in these systems. It's also the most reliable. And it's produced in what's called a bolt production system. I didn't mean to do that. It can be produced in what's called a totem system, which is what's pictured here on the bottom, which is different. But the mushrooms that are actually produced in totem systems are more typically oyster or lion's mane. Now, both oyster and lion's mane are produced much, much less commonly than shiitake in these systems. So they're sort of a newer iteration. These also can be produced in bolts, but completely opposite of shiitake. They are typically produced with totems. I'm also going to touch a little bit on wine cap mushrooms or Stropharia. They're produced differently. They're produced on a wood chip bed system. And I'm just going to touch on that a little bit closer to the end. So all of these mushrooms are actually, the type of fungi that they are saprophytes or detrivores. And so that means that they consume dead matter. So they're not pathogenic. They're not other types of fungi. And what they're really specialized at is that they're adapted to consume biomass that has a really high carbon concentration and different kinds of carbon structures that are typically hard to break down. All right, so I'm going to talk a lot about substrates today. When I talk about substrates, I'm basically talking about mushroom food. And when we're talking about these systems, I'm talking about hardwoods. Softwoods are not used in the systems that have been developed so far, and they don't work with the mushrooms that I'm going to talk about today. Some ideal ones that have been sort of tried and true, some of them have been tested, but typically ideal for shiitake, we're talking about oaks. Oyster is the only one that apparently typically doesn't like an oak. Shiitake also likes hard and sugar maples, hornbeams, sweet gum, Beech and hickory also perform okay. This is followed by alder and birch and soft maples, which are considered moderate producers. And then in the ones that are actually sort of not recommended are aspen, willow, poplar, except for oyster. Oyster actually likes these softer hardwoods. Fruitwoods, white ash, black locust, and walnut. An interesting thing about this, though, is that they've never actually, I mean, there's only been a few that have actually been tested in a research situation. A lot of this is observational, anecdotal information. And as far as the Pacific Northwest goes, none of it's been tested as far as we can tell in a research situation. So big leaf, maple, Oregon white oak, hazelnut, vine maple, Oregon ash, bitter cherry, tan oak, Pacific dogwood, buckthorn, nothing's been tested. The quality that you're looking for when you're doing logs for substrates is something you have to remember is that the logs need to be fresh cut, and there's a couple of reasons why. Old logs might have a lower internal moisture, which is critical for the initial what's called spawn run after you inoculate the substrate with the mushroom that you want to grow. And number two, they might already be colonized with some other wild saprophytic fungi. Typically, they're harvested while they're dormant. So this is before bud break in the winter or in very, very early spring. What can happen with a later harvest that's post bud break is you risk what's called bark slippage. And what happens with that is that when the tree is dormant, the cambial cell walls are hardened off, but when you have an actively growing cambium after dormancy breaks, the cell walls tend to be thinner, and therefore they don't hold onto the bark as well. This is a picture of beech from the Northeast that is showing bark slippage. Dormancy also, you have to think about a tree trunk as a food storage organ, and you've got these unspent carbohydrates that are stored in the trunk that are at their highest potential when you're before the buds break. So it's a plus. Okay, so when cutting bolts, they're typically 4 to 6 inches in diameter and about 3 to 4 feet long. And when you're talking about totems, these are typically about 8 to 12 inches in diameter and in total about 2.5 feet long. We're a little bit shorter. Again, so an important aspect is that the wood must die before inoculation because we're talking about saprophytic fungi. It's not suitable for these types of fungi. Living tissues for parasitic fungi, pathogenic fungi, symbiotic fungi, but not saprophytic. So there can also be antifungal compounds that are still produced while the wood is still alive. So this part is really important. Typically, the general guideline for the time it takes for wood to die after being cut pre-dormancy or before dormancy breaks is about 3 weeks. It could be longer, it could be less, depending on species, but that's the typical time that's recommended. Sort of what you're shooting for is you're shooting for this inoculation sweet spot. So you're going to inoculate these logs with the mushroom species that you want to and the strain that you want, right? And what you're shooting for is after the tree dies, but before other fungi colonize it, and while the log's internal moisture is still high. So that's really what you're shooting for. Just a little tip too is moving logs off the forest floor after cutting can reduce some risk of other fungi colonizing. And if you're storing logs until you can inoculate them, you're going to want to think about keeping them out of sun, out of wind, someplace that's humid but not necessarily wet. Because if it's wet, what's going to happen is you're going to more readily introduce fungi into the log that you don't want there. Another aspect to remember with preparing to inoculate is when you're moving logs, mind the bark. It's not like firewood. You don't want to be chucking it around. You want to actually keep that bark intact, because what that's going to do is it's going to protect from other fungi that want to get in. And it's also going to help keep the internal moisture of the log high. So the inoculation steps, there's two main spawn types for forest cultivated mushroom systems. There's hardwood sawdust, and there's hardwood plugs or dowels, which are pictured here and here. This is the sawdust actually in a totem system right here. And what these are is they're inoculated with the fungal mycelium that you want, rather than spores. And what this gives you is it's a clone of a given strain. You're going to want to keep any inoculum that you have or spawn that you have refrigerated. You can typically store it up to 6 months if it's in a cool, dark place. You have to remember though that it's living, and so you don't want to suffocate it. So if you store it in a plastic bag, it can't be sealed for very long during that storage time. Early spring is the most typical inoculation timing, which probably makes sense since you're cutting logs in the late winter, and you don't want them to decline in quality. Later can work, so later inoculations can work, but you just get this increased risk of feral fungi that come in and reduced yield of the mushrooms that you want. So the inoculation setup, so you're going to want to think about some kind of preferred place. So you want some place that's adjacent to the logs and adjacent to the laying yard ideally, because the less you have to move the logs, the better. They get heavy over time. You need a covered space for the northwest spring. Shade is a big plus too. You need some spot with good access to electricity. You're going to need some sort of drilling tool because you're going to drill into these logs. You need sawbucks or something to hold the log while you're drilling. You're going to need inoculation tools that help you put the spawn inside the logs. You need food grade cheese wax that seals the holes that you're going to drill in the logs. You need some sort of non-flame hot plate or pot to actually melt the wax. The reason you don't want a flame, some sort of flame in there, is because the cheese wax is flammable. You also want some kind of non-poly medium paintbrush or some sort of commercial wax applicator so that you can apply the wax to the logs. You want some sort of table that you're not worried about getting wax on, because you'll get wax everywhere. And then some sort of open container for holding spawn during inoculation. So this image just shows each of those aspects or attributes. This little schematic shows a log where the spawn plug is going through the bark into the sapwood, which is actually where you want to get your spawn in contact with, because that's typically where the mycelium will grow and produce mushrooms from, versus the heartwood, if your tree even has much or any heartwood. This is what it looks like afterward, after you get the wax on top of it. So the wax does two main things. Because it's hot, it actually sterilizes a bit. But number two, it also helps keep fungi out and moisture in. These are just some pictures of the inoculation setup that we had. You can see sawbucks. This is where we were doing our drilling. This is the inoculation process. So we've got holes in this log, and these are the applicators. We're taking our spawn and putting them inside. And then this is a sort of specialized wax applicator that holds wax inside it. Inoculation holes are typically 4 inches apart in the row, and each row is offset, so it's sort of a star pattern, and they're placed about 2 to 3 inches apart, depending on the size of the log. This is a little video I have of the actual process of drilling. So this is me measuring the diameter, determining I want probably 5 holes for this one, or it's a 5-inch log. I made a chart. You don't need to do this, but we did this for research purposes. So on that chart, I'm pointing to number 8. So that's going to give me 8 rows for a 5-inch log, basically. So right here, I'm using a 10,000 RPM angle grinder that's modified with a 1/2 inch by 1 bit. And the reason why we do this is because if you're doing logs at any volume, this is so much faster than a typical drill, even a high-speed drill. You can see how fast you can just move down the line and drill these holes. Mentioned that already. Drilling for plugs or dowels is actually smaller. So it's a 5/16 hole by 1 inch. I just wanted to mention that. All right. So this is a video of inoculating bolts with sawdust spawn. So here's our spawn. And what I do is I break it up in a bucket. You don't have to. You can actually use the bag if you're doing a small amount. But because we were doing a lot, we used these gutters. We modified these gutters to fit our spawn so that we could sort of move down the length of the log and always have spawn right there. These are a couple different inoculation tools. That one's a palm. You hit it with your palm. This one, you use your thumb to actually push the spawn in. And this is a fairly expensive one that it's sort of a 2-in-1. It puts the inoculant in, or puts the spawn in, and it puts in a little styrofoam plug. We found that it didn't work that great, so we didn't use it very much, but we used it for demoing. So here's just using the palm one. So you fill up the inoculation tool with spawn, and then you slap the end with your palm, move down the line. This is the thumb one, really similar. Exact same process, except for you're just pushing it with your thumb. And it's actually kind of nice to have both of those if you're doing a lot, because you can get a lot of opportunity for repetitive stress, either on your palm or your thumb. This is just pulling it out of the bag. This is actually a video of Patrick doing it in their trials. So this is what it looks like to do, instead of sawdust, to do peg or dowel spawn. So this is actually Patrick again. So it's a smaller hole, and you just pound it in with a rubber mallet. You use the rubber mallet to keep the bark from getting beat up while you do it. So this is the waxing process with sawdust spawn. I'm just indicating here that you cut it up, and we found that using an electric frying pan worked really great. So we just got this at a thrift store, and you can totally, the nicest thing about it is well, A, it doesn't have a flame, but number 2, you can set it at the exact temperature that you want. We found that at about 200 degrees, I think it was, you can keep the wax from burning and evaporating, because after a certain point you hit the flash point and it starts to evaporate. So just a couple different methods. This is just using a brush Again, you don't want to use a poly brush because they tend to melt in the wax. This is an Akuta inoculation tool where it's called a high volume applicator because you can fill up that chamber. And it's got a little foam end on it. And so you can see you can walk down the line and not have to refill it. They're a little quirky, but they do work pretty well once you get the hang of it. This is just using a foam type paintbrush. They work pretty well, except for they like to disintegrate over a while. So it's kind of a trade-off between buying a specialized tool and using what you've got. It depends sort of on how many logs you're going to do. This is just Patrick doing an alternative method. They used a spoon for a little while. All right, so this is the inoculation setup for a totem system, where the sawdust spawn goes in between these pieces of log. So you've got two 1 foot long pieces and then about a 2-inch thick cap that goes on top of it. And between each layer, you've got about a 1/4-inch layer of spawn. And after you do that, one method that people use to keep fungi out and moisture in, this is Steve Gabriel at Cornell, is they place a bag over the top that's breathable. This is me doing a demo of a totem inoculation. So again, breaking the spawn up so we can spread it out. I used a 1 cup so I could measure it out. Again, it's not totally critical if you're doing this on a commercial scale, but we did it for research because we want to keep things consistent. So it's about an 11-inch log, 2 to 3 cups. So on the bottom first, I used about half the amount for the bottom. Two cups. I'm going to try it out here. Wasn't quite enough, so I'm going to add a little bit more. Three cups. And then essentially, well, you can see that there's about a 1/4 inch there. And so you add your next layer and you essentially repeat the process over until you get to putting the cap on the top. And you're done. So it's a pretty simple inoculation process. It does use a lot of spawn though. All right, so the place where you're gonna produce your mushrooms on any kind of scale is called a laying yard. So the things that are key about a laying yard is you want some place that's a shaded forest canopy, something with protection from direct sun, something with protection from drying winds, and that's sufficiently well drained. So you don't want a spot that turns into a swamp in the winter, basically. Some other aspects that are big pluses: someplace that's north facing, someplace that's near a source of humidity, of constant humidity, so like a wet area or a pond. Evergreen shade is a plus because it gives you year-round shade. You're going to want to think about a protective layer between the forest floor and the logs. So in this picture, they had pallets. That's what we used too in our trials. You need some place that you've got access to water, that it's not prohibitively difficult to get to water, because you're going to need to use it, as you're going to see in a bit. And typically what you're shooting for is, what's optimal is you're shooting for someplace that's going to be able to maintain this average of 59 to 82 degrees Fahrenheit and 80 to 85% relative humidity. Now, obviously you're not going to find that perfectly outdoors, but that's what you could sort of keep in mind with it. And a big aspect about this is not only that you're going to be producing mushrooms in this range, but you need to maintain log moisture. Especially for shiitake, once the internal log moisture gets below 25%, it becomes in danger of becoming a non-viable fungus anymore, and it won't produce. It's game over. And I know we're talking about the Northwest, and most people are probably thinking, well, this is going to be no problem. It rains here all the time. But right now is the exact reason why we do need to think about log moisture and be worried about it, because of this period here. Oh, let me go back. This period here. So this is Ithaca, New York, where a lot of the research that's been done on these systems has been done. There's no prominent dry season necessarily. It gets a little bit drier during the summer, but precipitation also goes up, humidity goes up during certain parts of the day. Whereas in the Northwest, in the Western Northwest, you get this peak of sunshine, this low point of cloudy days, low point of precipitation, and low point of humidity. All right. So on the road to harvest with shiitake, so what's called the spawn run, so how long it actually takes the mycelium to colonize the log before it can actually produce mushrooms, is called the spawn run. And that for shiitake, it's 6 to 12 months. Harvest timing of shiitake depends on the strain that you produce. There's a lot of different types of strains of shiitake because, again, this is one of the more developed types of mushrooms to produce in these systems. Cool weather in the fall and the spring. Cool weather strains are typically produced in the fall and the spring. Wide range strains typically produce in the summer, but they can produce also in the fall and the spring. And then warm weather strains only fruit in the summer. And this aspect right here where I talk about forced is something called forced fruiting, which is I'm going to talk about right now. So forced fruiting is a 24-hour complete water immersion. And this is typically how it's done. You've got some sort of vessel like this stock tank. You fill it with water and you completely immerse the logs in water for 24 hours. It's really important that they are totally immersed because this is best for saturation. And what forced fruiting does is it provides a uniform, predictable fruiting. It induces a physiological change for the mushroom where the rapid shift in temperature and the rapid shift in moisture actually induce fruiting. And you can do this typically 3 times per season, and that gives you about 7 to 8 weeks between fruitings. On average, log production, these logs can produce between 3 to 5 years. Now for the Northwest, we really don't know because we don't know our species yet and how they produce, but in the Northeast and in the Midwest, 3 to 5 years is a general guideline that you can think of for how long they can produce for. So this is what shiitake looks like when it's ready to be harvested. The cap is curled under slightly still. This is just it being produced on a bunch of oak logs here. And below it here is a schematic from Ken Mudge and Steve Gabriel from Cornell in their book that they wrote that shows forced fruiting and a couple different ways that you can produce throughout the year. So down here you have CW, which is a cold weather strain, and this is a wide range strain, WR. And for the cold weather strain, you're producing from March to April, they typically they don't use forced fruiting. For some reason, they don't respond well to it, apparently, and they fruit naturally. But in the summer, the wide range strain gets forced fruited every 7 weeks. Oops, keep doing that. And this is just what the process looks like. So it comes out of what's called crib stacks, where they're stacked like this in the laying yard. They go into their into a dunk tank of some kind, and then you put them up in this A-frame to make harvest easier. And then afterward, you put them back in their crib stacks for the 7 weeks where they're going to rest before going back into the tank. All right, so for oyster and lion's mane, or sometimes lion's mane is sometimes called comb tooth. Spawn run for oyster is typically 4 to 12 months, whereas for lion's mane, it's the longest of all the ones we've mentioned so far at about 12 to 18 months. So here's oyster, here's lion's mane. There's no forced fruiting with these. You can't pick those totems up and put them in a dunk tank. And so it's natural, it's sporadic, so it's not necessarily predictable. Oyster typically fruits in the fall and the spring, but it does depend on the strain. They're also considered right before the caps curl upward, similar to shiitake. Lion's mane's a little bit harder to tell. What you have to watch out for is when these sort of icicles, is what they call them, are fully extended and before any browning or desiccation occurs. So you can sort of see on the top here that there's a little bit of browning, indicating that this is just starting to be beyond ripe. Some quick notes on Stropharia, or wine cap mushrooms. So these are the ones that are produced on wood chip beds, so totally different. The nice part about these is you can take your leftover logs and your pieces from the bolts and the totems, and you can chip them up and use them for Stropharia. You're gonna wanna mix fresh cut wood chips and partially composted wood chips. Apparently, this is the only type that will tolerate any percentage of softwood, and they don't recommend over 20%. You want a minimum of a 4 square foot bed size. This species is more adapted to partial shade, but the ideal's still sort of unknown. You can irrigate these in the driest parts of the summer, and we're suspecting that in the Northwest you probably will have to. These also fruit sporadically, so you want to you need to also make sure that you correctly identify them, because they're being produced on the ground, and there could be other mushrooms in there as well. If any of you are thinking about doing this as a business enterprise, I'm going to sort of take you through this real quick. So these systems, they're not really intended to be a sole enterprise or considered to be a sole enterprise. Really need to think of them more as some sort of supplemental side income, or some way to add value to your business overall. So some ideas about that. So if you had a CSA, for instance, you could increase your palette of crop offerings. Or if you're taking your produce to a farmer's market, same deal. Market them as forest grown. Market them as ecologically low impact. Market the nutritional benefits. If you've got some other mushroom business, if you've got an indoor production enterprise, or you do wildcrafted mushrooms, you could add a premium tier to complement that. Utilize local markets versus wholesale or commodity scale. Market to restaurants, produce value-added products, dehydrated mushrooms, jerky. These are actually probably needed anyway, because you're not always going to get perfect fresh mushrooms. Probably a pretty straightforward organic certification. Right now, there's really no synthetics that are used in the whole process. You could have a side business of spawn production or of strain development. I should say strain, not variety. That's me coming from my agronomy background and not my agroforestry background. Some people also sell whole inoculated logs at, say, the farmer's market. So people will buy the whole log that's inoculated, bring it home, and then they'll produce mushrooms at home. So why do it then? So if it's not a sole enterprise, why do you do it? So you've got a forest, so do your neighbors. There's a way to produce income from it. It fits in with your comprehensive forest management planning. Often thinning hardwoods out is part of that. It's typically low impact. You don't have to clear any land. You don't need a whole lot of timber. This is a big one. Relatively low barriers to entry when it comes to starting a business of some type. Low capital needs, low equipment and infrastructure demands. You know, the lower the investment, the lower the risk. Low maintenance overall, and not much land needed. They're also complementary with beginning farmer gateway markets such as produce. They fit in with produce arrays and other specialty ag products. And then as far as labor goes, you can do it alone or with a few people. People also enjoy volunteering for a bit. But that said, labor is always an issue. So labor may be a barrier for some, and that's probably one of the biggest aspects of this, because even though you don't have high equipment or infrastructure demands, probably labor is the biggest aspect that you do need to invest into it. These are just some material and labor investment estimates that Cornell put together. As far as labor goes, what their calculations came out to for a 4-foot long log is about 17.4 minutes per log. We did an estimate for when we did it and estimated that one well-oiled person, so somebody who's really got it down and knows how to do it, could do about 4.84 holes per minute, which equals about 16.1 minutes per log. This is actually a video of me doing the whole process with a nice flow of setup. This is what we figured out after doing it for a year. So doing the drilling took about 4 minutes total. It was about 30% of the time. The inoculation was about 5.2 minutes, which is about 38% time. So you can see it's a slower process. And then the waxing, which is about 4.3 minutes or 32% of the time. So you can see that the waxing, the inoculating is about 70% of your total time spent on this. And so if you're doing a labor plan about how to do it, you can offset using those estimates. So that with a nice setup, and I'm well practiced at it at this point. So it took me about 13.5 minutes to do that, that log. So what are some of the unknowns in the Northwest, especially about this? So a lot. So what's the optimal Pacific Northwest log species? What's the longevity of log production? What are the optimal mushroom strains for the Northwest? What's the potential yield for the Northwest? What kind of weedy fungi or feral fungi are we talking about that will be in competition with our mushrooms? Are there any compromising Northwest pests? Overall, what are the optimal systems? Do we need to manage moisture, and if we do, how much? Are there new methods, like entirely new methods, that need to be developed to do this? Is there pest and disease management that we're going to need to do that's specific to this climate, this environment? With forest-grown systems, are there any food safety issues, nutritional quality differences? We don't know any of these. And then the market. What's the market saturation point? competition from indoor grown mushrooms, wildcrafted mushrooms, what's the latitude of premium markets that exist, and the latitude of value added products that you could produce. So I'm going to move a little bit into our trials here. So 2 years ago, we put in a proposal to WSU through their BioAg grant program. This is actually a WSU funded grant, which is actually pretty rare. It's pretty great. And we got funded for this 2-year project of evaluating commercial specialty mushroom production for diversified farms and small woodland owners in Western Washington. And this is the whole trial altogether, which is totally overwhelming, and I know that. So I'm going to simplify it for you here. So what we've got is we've got 2 locations where we've got trials. So Southwest Washington and the Puget Sound, South Sound. We're looking at bolt systems for shiitake, totem systems for lion's mane and oyster, and wood chip beds for Stropharia. So we're actually just testing those systems out here that have been developed in the Northeast. We're looking at 4 different log substrate moisture management treatments. So what different ways might we manage moisture during the summer, especially? We're looking at 4 different hardwood substrates. Mostly we're looking at red alder and big leaf maple because these are the most abundant hardwoods in the Northwest. We're also looking at sweet cherry because it's a tree that's commonly feral in historic farming regions, so just escaped cherry, wild cherry. And then paper birch, which is also a commonly feral species that's found in urban and suburban areas and is also native in Northwest Washington. We're also doing a basic strain comparison. We're just looking at a wide range strain and a cool weather strain. We're also doing some smaller side studies looking at a warm weather strain and then a second wide range strain, but mainly we're just doing a comparison of wide range and cool weather strains. Just some pictures of the log substrates for the bolts from our trials: birch, cherry, maple, and alder. This is actually 2 replications from our trials. So this is going to introduce you to our moisture management treatments. So what we've got here is, what's covering these is what's called remay, or floating row cover, which is a spun polyester fabric. The reason why we chose this is because it's reflective, because it's white, it's breathable, and it's permeable. So it allows gas exchange and it allows water to get in when it rains. Typically, this floating row cover is used in crop production, where you sort of use it as some way to enhance heat or protect against frost. But they also do use what's called fruiting blankets in forest cultivated mushroom production systems. But in the Northeast, they just typically use it for fruiting. So when the logs are fruiting and the mushrooms are growing, it helps keep that humidity in and protects from wind and cool weather and drying. So underneath this remay, we have a couple different things that we're doing. So, oh, didn't mean to do that. Let me go back here. Okay. Number 1 here is we've got misters that are on irrigation timers that are underneath the remay. And what they do is they, 2 times a day, they go for a couple minutes and they spray right onto the remay. So it's actually not spraying on the logs, it's just modifying the humidity underneath. The second one is we did an immersive soak in the first year. Now, typically this is not done, but what we wanted to do is to see if we could actually help assure and increase the chance that spawn run happens in that first year. So we put these logs in, and then into the water, and then we put them underneath the remay throughout the rest of the spawn run. And then the last one is we put buckets underneath that have water, so that there's just this sort of passive, constant source of humidity underneath the remay and the other treatment, and the third treatment. Our Stropharia beds trial's a lot simpler. We just have two, so we've got a control, and then we've got drip irrigation on the other beds. So again, the goal with moisture management is that we're mitigating risk of moisture loss from low humidity, low rainfall, and the abundant sunshine that typically tends to happen from July to September, especially during spawn run in that first year. So managing moisture in the summer, again, we're trying to keep that internal moisture above 25%. So if you really wanted to do that, for a long time indefinitely, it would require a constant humidity of 95%. So you can see at 98%, we're staying at about 25 to 26%. So that's not very practical, right? So there's a couple of aspects that fed into the moisture management that we added to these treatments. So the immersive soaking, so actually replenishing that internal log moisture, because rain is going to replenish somewhat, but it's going to be somewhat superficial. It's not actually going to be able to get inside, or it's going to be limited to how much it's going to get inside. And then the second aspect with the remay, or the floating row cover, is to reduce that evaporative potential. So protect against low ambient relative humidity and number 2, wind. So some of the preliminary findings that we've got, the wide range strain is appearing to be pretty reliable for yield. The cool weather strain, on the other hand, hasn't yielded yet. So to be determined. I just wanted to point out too, this was our first harvest off of our logs. Just some pictures of our first harvest off of our logs this year. So far, it looks like, and this is, again, this is really preliminary, is that birch and alder, especially birch, is really producing well, at least in the beginning. We don't know if there's any delay on yield in some of these other species that aren't producing well yet. We don't know what the longevity of these logs are yet. It's all TBD. The tarped, or the remay covers, do appear to be retaining humidity over the controls, but we haven't figured out how significant that is or whether or not this transfers to yield yet. So stay tuned. Our soaked treatments do look like they at least have potential to be helping. They might have helped with a rapid spawn run or enhanced colonization of the log, and a possible yield advantage, at least in the beginning. We don't know yet how significant it is or what the long-term dynamics are, but we're going to try and figure it out. So we've got a number of different replicates. So all our treatments are replicated multiple times, and some of them are in drier spots than others. And it looks like logs in drier locations appear to be yielding less overall than ones that are in protected, more moist locations. We don't know if this is dead shiitake or if it's just had a delayed spawn run and it hasn't started producing yet. We're not sure. We did place our logs, as you can see in this picture, in the harvest blanket. So we wrapped them in remay, and the nice part about this is it protected the quality of the mushrooms, but it also helped keep the pests off. So we totally sealed it up, and it really helped keep any bugs or slugs or mice out of it. Oyster and lion's mane hasn't really started to produce anything significant yet. So it's in question whether or not this is viable within a commercial enterprise. Mushroom quality management, we still don't know. There's a lot of big questions about pests, feral fungi. These are just some pictures of different issues that we've seen. This is actually pests on mushrooms. So this is a sow bug. There's slugs, of course. There's mice. And then there's a number of insects that we've observed. This picture with the ripped remay is actually coyotes. So the coyotes like to, when it gets dry out, they go after water sources. So we've had some issues with that. We're also doing a little sub trial in 2020 where it's a fairly small trial compared to the rest. And we've got only 2 moisture management treatments. So we've got the 24-hour soaking again, and then our control, and I put that under remay. And then for this year, we added Oregon white oak. We weren't able to get cherry this year. We just, logistical issue in getting supply. And then another novel thing is that we have 2 log harvest timings. So we have our early harvested logs that were harvested when they were dormant. And then we've got late harvested logs that were harvested after dormancy to see if there's any difference in bark slippage in our species. And then some minor side observations. So we put sealant on some log ends, and then we're also doing a couple where we're looking at oyster and lion's mane in a bolt system. Just some heads up if you're just getting into it. I think this crowd is more is familiar with some of this stuff, but just in case. Felling timber and moving logs is dangerous. Be really careful. Adhere to chainsaw safety, chaps, helmets, gloves, face guards. Steel-toed boots were a big plus. Keep a sharp chain. Know the danger pitfalls of felling a tree. Know that you're going to trip a lot in the woods while you're doing this, and you're really going to curse trailing blackberry. Move logs with respect for their weight. Watch your fingers, your feet, your head, and your helpers too. Watch your back, lift with your legs. You will get in shape if you're not already. They're heavy, and yeah, you really will get in shape. Take breaks, rotate jobs when inoculating to avoid repetitive stress injuries. Be careful with hot wax and flammability, and know that if you get into this, there's still a lot to learn about it in this climate. So I think I've got about 10 minutes or so of questions here, and those are some resources for you while we're taking those.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Justin. We did get a few questions here. So yeah, way back at the beginning, someone asked about using conifers as substrate.
Nope. Yeah, these are all hardwood species and mushrooms that don't prefer conifers or don't produce at all.
Right. Are there? I don't remember. Are there any specialty mushrooms that do grow on conifers?
Not that I've heard of that have been developed in a system like this.
Sure. Someone also asked what you meant by bud break. I think you might have covered that, but
yeah, when dormancy breaks. That's what I mean.
Right.
When the buds actually start to open up and grow.
Mm-hmm. And is big leaf maple considered a hard maple or a soft maple?
It is soft. It is soft, and thus far, it is not producing well at all.
Yeah.
I'm pretty worried that it won't. Yeah, Patrick, you've got 2 sites you're dealing with up there. What are you seeing the same thing?
So far, very little has come from the maple.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on cutting trees, like high stumping them and then inoculating the stump?
Some people do it. It takes a lot more space. So if you're doing it on a small scale, maybe yes, but sure. not on any kind of commercial scale. Right.
I just want to encourage people to keep rolling in the questions so we can go until about 6 o'clock. Do you have any recommendations for like tools to measure temperature and relative humidity, like cheap options?
Cheap options. I mean, yeah, you can get cheap versions of, thermometers and things that measure humidity. But if you want to log it, you can buy data loggers that cost about about $100 each. So if you wanted to put them, just one in your laying yard, you could monitor it over time and look at it and see how you're doing. That's actually what we use for our trials. It's, it's not totally cheap, but it's not a huge investment either in the grand scheme of things.
Right. Yeah, mine seem to be holding up pretty well. So one person commented, John commented, around our place, I'd wonder whether to worry about deer predation and maybe slightly saline irrigation water. Any thoughts on that?
What was that? Saving?
Slightly
irrigation?
saline. Like saline.
Saline irrigation water.
Yep.
I don't know about saline irrigation water. Deer, we haven't had an issue with yet. I don't know if you have, Patrick.
No, I don't think that's very common. At the McCleary site, there are definitely deer there, and we haven't had any issues with that. Slugs are a problem for sure. That's the main concern. Yeah,
and because I don't know if wrapping the logs in the remay throughout the fruiting period, I don't know if that helps out of sight, out of mind. But it helped with everything else, and maybe it helps with deer too. I don't know.
Right. Steve asked if I call arborists, are arborists in general willing to provide cut oak logs for it? Did you source any from arborists? Any of your substrate, I guess, question?
No, I didn't source any from arborists. We either sourced from on-site or people that we got in contact with. With the oak logs, because there's a restriction on cutting in Washington, what I did was I contacted somebody at OSU Extension, and they connected me with their forest owner network and asked if anybody had thinning that they needed done in restoration plannings. And that's how we got our oak logs.
Oh, nice. Are you looking for any locations to do more testing?
Not right now, but in the future, hopefully, yeah. If we can get more funding to keep this going.
And Lenore asked, why didn't you opt for the dowel plugs as opposed to the sawdust?
Because in the grand scheme, they're more expensive.
Right.
So if you want to do a larger scale sawdust spawn is more economical. Even with having to purchase the inoculation tools.
Great. Craig just commented, if you ever need cherry, he's got a lot of it, and it sounds like he's in Cowlitz County. So
Yeah. So on these old farming regions, it's just kind of all over the place. Obviously not as abundant as alder and maple or some native species, but it's there. It's a bummer that in a way that there's not more birch out there, because it does seem to be doing really well so far. But yeah, in urban areas, it's an escaped ornamental. So
right.
You can find patches of it and people that are probably trying to get rid of it.
It looks like Andy commented, he just had a few recommendations there for some meters, some loggers for measuring relative humidity and things like that. It looks like Costco weather stations are pretty cheap. So
yeah,
interesting. One question I thought of just during that is, if people are doing this and they find some feral fungi growing on their logs, what should they do?
I wouldn't do any. I mean, we don't know which species and how bad the competition is yet, so I wouldn't jump to any conclusions about, the log is a goner, so to speak. I mean, we had some last year that had a bunch of feral fungi on the surface, on the outside, that produced totally fine this year.
Yeah, I'll say at our trial, I noticed some feral fungi within 2 months after inoculation. And it didn't, I mean, we don't know for sure, but it didn't really seem to correlate with any negative production.
No.
So far.
No.
Well, it's 5:58, so I think unless anybody's got some other questions, we can just kind of wrap it up there. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you.
Glad we got some preliminary data in there. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I was working feverishly to actually get data, but it was too much. It's fresh off the press, so.
That's good. Great. Well, oh, David did ask a good question here. I'll ask it really quick. Any plans for future hands-on training after COVID subsides? And I would say yes at some point, right? Justin will be doing something.
Yep, absolutely. We did one before COVID, so we're sort of set up, and we were getting ready to do one. Patrick and Stephen and I were getting ready to do another one together right before COVID. So, yep, we've got that ready to go.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that, to be honest.
Yeah.
All right, well, yeah, thank you. And thank you, everybody that stuck it out. I know it's getting on to dinner time. Nick just posted a survey link in the chat box. Please, I really encourage you all to take that survey and let us know your thoughts on the program. As we said before, this was our Tree Farm's first adventure into online programming. So I'm sure there's lessons to be learned. But really appreciate your thoughts on that. There's also an opportunity to donate to the Tree Farm program. We did not ask for any registration fee for this because, again, it was our first shot at an online program. We didn't want it to be exclusive by any means. So if you are feeling generous, please feel free to donate so that we can kind of keep putting these on, especially next year. Hopefully it will be in person, but we'll see. And both of the speakers are available for questions. If you have in the future, you can also reach out to me and I'll relay those questions if you need to. But otherwise, have a great night and we'll see you next year at the next seminar.